Seven Deadly Sins is one of the greatest shonen anime out there, and unfortunately, far too many people, especially in the West and Japanese, it gets hella love, don't seem to fully understand what's going on here. I mean, after just watching the first season, I wouldn't either, and that's the point. The vibe the first season gives off for its majority is a lighthearted, goofy, fun adventure of awesome, badass knights grouping together to take down the bad guys. Hell yeah, it's a lot of fun. But as the story progresses, it gets continually darker and deeper at about the same rate as the characters' stories are fleshed out in accordance with how the world develops. Decided that I wanted to put a video together, the impact of each sin of the Seven Deadly Sins, discussing why each of these seven genuinely brilliantly written characters are integral to the story, how they affect the story, and how they make the story itself and all the themes within it seem so much more potent. These videos take a bit longer to make because they're, long AF. But for a while now, I wanted to start a series talking about the impact of several groups of characters from various anime. I already did one on the Yonko in One Piece. I am working on one for the Uchiha in Naruto. And let me know in the comments if there's any other groups that you want me to talk about. It's a lot of fun to make, even though it takes its very slight, borderline, non-existent toll. Because since I get to talk about so many characters and so many aspects of a story that I like, you know, it just makes it more fun on my end. And hey, that's what really counts here. I mean, I love if you enjoyed the video too, but let's be real. If I didn't like making them, you wouldn't be getting them. Feel free to like and subscribe for future episodes of this series. But for now, let's get into the meat and potatoes of how each of the seven deadly sins impact the narrative. I also want you to note that I will be going out of order, and this will not be in order of appearance, because I feel like getting my points across for the greater tale, I would be doing a much better and more concise job bunching several together. So the brilliantly crafted order will be Meliodas, Ban, Escanor, Gowther, King, Diane, Merlin, and then Lord Twigo bringing up the rear as the 8th secret sin. We all know it by now. Now, of course, please let me finish discussing the first 3-4 members of the sins before explaining to you exactly why I selected this particular order, because I believe that explaining my order to you after getting through the first 3 or 4 sins will hit harder than if I were to explain it to you now. I just honestly believe going into this particular order blind will make it far more effective to get across the point I'm really trying to get across here. So, with that said, let us begin! Meliodas, the sin of wrath. So here's the thing about main characters. By definition, we're looking at everything through their eyes, and we're experiencing the story through their experiences. Now, with most shonen anime, which is generally focused on personal growth, we have our wide-eyed and inspired protagonist who will do everything in his power to do what's right and become the best. So obviously, I'm generalizing here a lot, but when I go into a shonen anime, I'm expecting a growth story with the main character as the focal point. Now, Meliodas takes you for a complete run for your money, because what if that main character is not being introduced at the beginning of their life, where they have adventures ahead, friendships to make, tragedies to muddle through? But what if we're introduced to a character right off the bat that's already in the middle of their story? A character that's gone through the growths, gone through the stigmatization of falling in love with someone that is not your own race, is already very powerful and suffered immensely. We're following a character that is already mostly through their path, not beginning it. So, when we're originally introduced to Meliodas, and we're still under the impression that it's the fun, hype-loving, badass series that the first season is really trying to get across, it's all cool that we're seeing everything through his eyes, even if what we're seeing is Meliodas going around destroying his opponents. But the thing is about Meliodas, unlike every other shonen protagonist ever, we don't get any inner monologues, and not only that, we are never let into his mind to know what he's actually thinking. Not once throughout the series do we get Meliodas' honest inner take on any situation whatsoever. That is, until the druid training arc in the middle of season 2. Instead, we just constantly see him with that bland expression on his face, gleefully having a good time, never getting overly excited about anything, and also never getting sad about anything. He's a neutral, positive fellow. At least, that's how we see him in the beginning. We only realize that the seven deadly sins, especially the first first season is a bright and cheery mask in comparison to the actual story that takes place later, just like Meliodas is that bright and cheery mask of the person that we understand him to be later. Despite being one of the most fun, outgoing, jolly, carefree protagonists ever, he's revealed to have one of the most tragic backstories ever. He was cursed with immortality, and he has to live through his love being reincarnated in every generation and watch her die. Now, he cannot get angry, because if he does, he'll wreck everything. I mean, he's done that with a country in the past. He may have learned from his mistakes. So, we understand his complacent, carefree persona is a painful mask, trying to suppress a destructive inner personality. He's constantly, actively suppressing emotion. His little training arc with the druids is one of my favorite anime training arcs of all time, because it's not the exercise itself that gave him strength, but the exercise made him fit to receive his strength that was sealed off of him. Remember, we don't want him to get angry and accidentally destroy countries because, well, that could ruin someone's whole day. So this is the guy that had enough resolve to live through his love dying in front of his eyes over and over and over until he was able to start crying and not get angry, but just get sad and begin to look at the future. Meliodas' journey, for the most part of the series, starts off as the carefree, complacent, jolly bastard that's concealing his suffering inside, not letting it peep out, to a carefree, jolly bastard that's genuinely happy with eyes on the future instead of eyes on the past. Perfectly in tandem with the series, with the first half of the story being absolutely just a fun time, but as the story progresses, we stop learning about the past, and our eyes are set in the reality of this bleak world, looking into the future. Meliodas finally accepts reality for what it is and seeks to change it, at the same time as the story drops the jolly facade and we realize the bleak world we're living in. Being that he's comfortably the main character, when he's missing for tons of chapters at a time in the manga, his loss is very felt, but when he returns, I guarantee you that return will be incredible. Next, we have Ban, basically anime Deadpool. Also, coincidentally, Meliodas' best friend, and not gonna lie, in this anime, he's my best friend too. Similarly to Meliodas, this fellow is also constantly suffering over his past, but puts up a straw man, rambunctious persona to painfully avoid the core of the issue. He watched his love die as well, but unlike Meliodas, who has a focal point to his anger, and who isn't per se angry at himself or anything, Elaine died, giving Ban immortality. Not only did Ban not manage to save her, but she could have been saved had she decided to drink it and let Ban die. Every moment Ban is alive, and every time Ban regenerates from mortal wounds. That all came from Elaine's death, and he thinks of that every single moment of his waking life. Now, Meliodas and Ban are two completely different people. They both suffered massive mental traumas in the past, and I guess superficially they kind of seem similar. Meliodas' love died, Ban's love died, but because of the slight nuances in their character and nuances in how their lives were extinguished, Meliodas puts up a persona of zero emotion so as not to feel pain. It's not that he hates himself per se, he just doesn't really want to suffer, and I don't blame him really. So the persona he puts up is that of no emotions, so he feels nothing. Ban, on the other hand, he has a hatred for himself, and that is what's transformed into his masochistic personality. And in contrast, the persona Ban puts up is not that he has no emotions, but that he's overflowing with them, avoiding the ones he doesn't really want to feel, as long as he can. Now, Meliodas is the main character, and more or less does everything right, considering his mental state, while he's trying to cope with the suffering. You know, fights bad guys, he's a nice dude, he doesn't completely go off his rocker, he's mentally in pain, and he copes with that pain by snuffing out his own emotions, but in the end of the day, he's not self-destructive, and he doesn't let this pain change his personality and sense of justice. Ban, on the other hand, does not cope. He tortured himself in Bast Dungeon for 10 years before the sins regathered, and he makes terrible mistakes. He tried to kill Meliodas at the whim of the goddesses at the end of season 1 for a shot at happiness, and he regretted that mistake he made for forever. Again, both suffered similar mental trauma, but Meliodas had someone else to blame, and therefore was able to survive smothering emotions until he eventually embraced them to move on, while Ban blamed himself and made him one of the most relatable anime characters to me of all time. My Ban video is one of my 5 favorite videos I've ever made, and I will link it in the description because I really discuss his character development throughout the series and his mental state throughout the series. But Ban's development is extremely different to Meliodas's. Meliodas, in that training druid arc, learned that he has to embrace his emotions and accept reality as opposed to push it away, whereas Ban's development was never about embracing reality. It was never about embracing his emotions. He has his emotions. He's constantly in an up and down. Yes, he acts in a far more rambunctious way than he naturally would to take his mind off things, and he does genuinely like his friends, but his downtime is honestly so sad to look at. When he was traveling around with Jericho in the beginning of season 2, it was heartbreaking every scene he was in, just looking at his expression. He feels his emotions, and he lives in reality, and he understands the reality that Helene is dead because of him. As the sin of greed, his whole life was all about taking. He wanted to steal the Fountain of Youth, and when he heard he can have Helene revived by killing Meliodas, he would try to do so. Again, stemming from greed. His development was trusting in others and selflessly giving them. A complete opposite of his core personality, and it's the act of giving others and trusting others that let him develop more of a self-confidence in himself. He's not a terrible guy either, and not only that, but his life is worthwhile. Him entering into purgatory in the manga to help out Meliodas was phenomenal. The latest chapter of the 7 Deadly Sins manga, which I don't really want to spoil, had absolutely no fighting, but was one of my favorite chapters in the entire series. Ban's depression and mental issues are things that I see in myself, and I believe many people see in themselves as well. No, I did not have a lolly spit Hashirama jizz in my mouth as she got destroyed by a demon in front of my eyes. Not exactly what I'm trying to get at here. Many of us have been in spots in our life where it's all about ourselves, it's all about taking, there's a lack of accomplishment and a feeling of worthlessness, and it can stem from really anything, but develop into almost anything as well. Making the wrong decisions is never easier than when you hate yourself as is, so grappling your way out of your mental darkness is nearly impossible. Ban manages to do that in his story in a very different way than Meliodas, and in a way that's far closer to my heart. And if you're starting to wonder where the title of this video comes in, the impact of each sin, give me a minute. Let me talk about Escanor, and then I will explain why they're in this order and what exactly I believe the 7 Deadly Sins is actually about. The Lion Sin of Pride, Lord Escanor. Okay, so Escanor is a bit of a tricky subject, because while I don't want to go ahead and say he has a split personality disorder between night and day, it's my firm belief that effects in his past that shaped who he is today shaped a different person at night than the one during the day. Since his youth, he was exiled from his hometown for being considered a monster, and that caused 2 reactions in his actual psyche. If he accepts the stigmatization and realizes it's a false statement and he was wrongly accused, then of course he would be undyingly grateful for the friends that actually find him and take him out of his predicament. And he would realize that he's nothing without his friends. For example, he would risk his life at night to save Ban, Elaine, and apprentice Holy Knight Jericho, making him always sad and grateful, and unfortunately basically developing an inferiority complex. Or the second way he could have accepted this stigmatization, it would be discarding his own mentality and get enveloped in the stigma. He let the words of the villagers that excommunicated him really hit home and really affect him. He began to believe that he was some overpowered monster, and it's developed a disastrous superiority complex. And that is his personality during the day. So while they're both completely natural reactions to the trauma that actually befell him, whether it's an inferiority complex at night or a superiority complex during the day, and both of them happen depending on his personality at that point in time, both are terrible for different reasons, and both can't lead a happy, normal life. It's because of this that at night he feels like an inadequate member of the Sins, caring for his friends nervously, knowing that he won't have a shot with Merlin. But during the day, well, he does know he'll have a shot with Merlin. He's Lord Escanor. And the only reason why he could see Merlin as someone worthy of his love, not gonna lie, it's probably because her power is literally infinity, something that he can actually look up to. But that aside, we know how deep-seated this superiority complex goes because in his fight with Estarossa, if he'd have any hatred in his heart towards Estarossa, he'd be completely immobilized. But he had no hatred at all. He could fight at full power against the person that allegedly killed Meliodas, the guy who saved the exiled Escanor before Escanor's very eyes. But still, Escanor felt no hatred towards Estarossa, he merely felt pity. I mean, it worked out for him in that fight. He was able to, kick his ass instead of be a quivering lump of muscles on the floor. But any mentally sound person that has a friend that did as much for them as Meliodas did for Escanor, they should be absolutely furious, especially towards the one that killed him. But Escanor wasn't. He's become so supremely prideful, he doesn't love or hate almost anyone, and he merely pities everyone. You're probably wondering when I'm gonna start talking about how he actually impacts the Seven Deadly Sins story itself, and I will get there. He's so prideful that he doesn't even realize how tragic of a mental state he's in. Now, I'm really glad we've covered this briefly, because again, this mental trauma that stems from his past is very different than both Meliodas's and Ban's, despite the fact that it does bear some slight similarities and therefore ties into the theme that I'm about to discuss. Escanor's mental suffering is masked by his overpoweringly arrogant, prideful, smug persona, but he doesn't use his outwardly prideful, content mastery as a mask to suppress suffering like Meliodas does, and he isn't in a weak-minded mental state like Ban was when he was overly jovial trying to move his attention away from his emotions because he blamed himself. Escanor genuinely believes himself to be perfect in day form, and he doesn't hide anything with an overly rambunctious personality either. Both Ban and Meliodas made conscious decisions to steer clear of their painful pasts in one way or another. But Escanor genuinely doesn't realize how much he's suffering because he's too prideful to pick up on the fact that there's something terribly wrong with him that's hampering his life. So, in a brief overview of the last three characters I've discussed, who I consider the holy trinity of the Seven Deadly Sins as my three favorite characters, they each had a terrible mental trauma in their past. But because of the difference in circumstances, difference in character personalities, and slight difference in the tragedy itself, it's developed three completely different psychological issues that each of these three characters battle with every day. Meliodas suppressing his emotions and not accepting reality, Ban angry at himself and properly depressed, and Escanor with an inferiority/superiority complex depending on the time of day. Three extremely prevalent psychological issues that exist in our very own world as well, that I'm sure many of you have experienced in some shape or form, just like I did, which is why I relate so well to these characters. But the other similarity between the psychological issues and the defense mechanisms each character's taken to try to cope with them is a mask. None of them outwardly look like they're suffering inside, and that mask is part of their mental issues as well. Meliodas suffered, so he implemented this mask, which in turn removed him from reality. Ban suffered, implemented the mask, and that made him completely vulnerable to pressure. And Escanor suffered in the past, implemented a mask, and that kept him from love. The theme of the Seven Deadly Sins that I'm most attuned to, and this is the real impact of these three characters for me, at least, on the narrative of the Seven Deadly Sins, and honestly, the reason why I praise it so damn highly is the fact that on the surface level, it's a fun adventure, easygoing shonen with fun, adventurous, easygoing characters. But that in itself is just a mask to the psychological and philosophical story underneath that's taking place. The state of the narrative is the same as the state of all of these characters, being fun, happy, and friendly on the surface that you just want to chill with, but on a deeper level, it's pure pandemonium. Meliodas, as the main character, has his personal story encompass the entirety of the narrative, from the war 3,000 years ago that he caused to end to the war going on right now that he's again playing a massive role in. You got Ban's story, which is again a personal story, but it's not as broad as the narrative itself. It's as broad as a human psychological development, from suffering to making friends to being greedy and only using them as tools to survive to eventually grow and give them. In fact, his power in the latest chapter of the manga was called Gift, if that metaphor wasn't clear enough already, that he has to start giving to break out of his subconscious suffering. Ban is the most fleshed out character in the entire story, but it's purely on a personal level, it's not on a narrative scale. And then you have Escanor, who's not written to encompass the entire narrative like Meliodas, and he's not written to be a full fleshed out character development story like Ban either. The actual glimpses into his true character are far more minute, infrequent, and less important to the narrative than anyone else's. Yet at the same time, he has his own mental strife, and it's really important too. Everyone's mental burdens are important, no matter how menial. Escanor's a glimpse of a personal journey, Ban is the entirety of a personal journey, and Meliodas is a personal but also historic journey. That's why these three guys, in my opinion, are the holy trinity of the 7 deadly sins, and I highly recommend this anime to everyone, actually, especially if you've ever suffered any form of depression or mental issues in your past. Now, the series gets a lot of slack for not taking itself seriously and for having some cringy, corny humor, especially in the beginning, but that facade is dropped as the series progresses and as we learn more about the characters in the world. A lot of people do not look at the 7 deadly sins in this light, and honestly, I'm a little upset by that sometimes, and I'm really happy I had the opportunity to put hours upon hours of thinking and energy into the videos I've made on the series, because I don't think anyone else is really talking about it in an analytical light, even though there's really a lot to talk about. So I urge you to please share around this video, show it to your friends if you want them to gain maybe possibly an extra appreciation for the series that they may not have grasped beforehand, whether they haven't seen the series yet and you're trying to get them into it, because this video did not really contain any spoilers, whether they've begun and dropped the series because it's cringy humor and not very serious, doesn't concentrate on the themes of shows like Hero Academia, which talks about society and how evil takes different shapes in society. This is not deep on a societal level, and it's not deep on a world-building level. It's deep on a psychological level, and that's why I really appreciate it. So again, I would really appreciate it if you shared it around. I would like more people to see the series this way, honestly, because everyone who I talk to about this series is like, hell yeah, it's oodles of fun, overpowered good guys fighting overpowered bad guys. The stakes are always high. It's a lot of fun. Hell yeah, I love Ban. He's always happy. Those are the people that need to watch this video too. But in any case, I digress. I'm sorry for advertising my own video that you're currently watching in the middle of the video. Try not to do that, but I really would like more people to see it, especially because I find myself criticized for liking this series, even though it's clearly not as deep and cerebral as other anime series that actually care about things like power scaling, which honestly, no, the 7 deadly sins sucks at power scaling, but that's really not the point. Moving on! By the stash of Lord Twigo, we're at 20 minutes, only covered 3 sins. I will be moving faster from here on out, especially because until here was the main point for me deciding to actually do this video, but there are some things I'd like to say about the rest of the characters as well. For example, Gowther! Everyone loves Gowther! Yeah, he wasn't annoying at all! So the thing is about Gowther, I can't really discuss his impact on the narrative without major manga spoilers, so I guess I'll give him his own video, just because I feel like I can't really talk about him here, but at the same time, I would like to make you slightly aware that he clearly does not have emotions to the extent that us humans or any other race ever has. He does not have normal emotions for reasons explained in the manga, but more importantly, it's his lack of emotion that's causing his striving for emotion, and that in turn, again, places him in a fascinating mental predicament. So the thing is, I have a lot of emotions, which is good, I guess. I think most of us probably do, and it's for that reason that I did not welcome him into the relatability of the Holy Trinity. I think he's great in amplifying this same theme about a facade with just sadness behind that facade, because that's kind of what his shell of a character is, without major spoilers. But the major reason why I like Gowther, and I like how he impacts the world, is because the mental scars we see in Meliodas, in Ban, and in Escanor, respectively, are all very human mental issues, and very human reactions to these mental issues, which again is why I like them so much and why I relate to them. But let's not forget that in the land of Britannia, which is a very fantasy land, we'll be having fantasy characters, which obviously do not share the same mentality as humanity does. So I do not relate to Gowther's position, but I do appreciate that the mentality he has, which is purely due to magic powers out of most of our controls. I mean, I'm not ruling Tekking out as far as being a fairy. I am 100% certain, in fact, that Tekking is a fairy, and we will see his wings in one of his Tekking tumbles one of these days. But aside from Tekking, most of us do not have magic powers, and therefore cannot relate to the magical, yet tragical, mental positions he's in. I do appreciate, though, that the 7 deadly sins is tackling mental burdens on characters that we cannot relate to for these reasons, because again, that's world building 101. Wow, I can't believe I actually managed to say all that without really any spoilers at all. Next sin, King, a fairy almost as terrifying as Tekking. Probably didn't see what I did there, so I won't point your attention to it at all. Yeah, I know, I'm deep like that. But here's my take on King and why I love him so much. Maybe not as much as those first three, but he's in my top 5 characters in the anime for sure. So the thing is, all the 4 sins that I've talked about until here, which again explains this brilliant order I've devised, has deep-seated mental issues while having some form of conscious or subconscious facade keeping them at bay. Now, King does not do the facade. He's the final of the male characters of the 7 Deadly Sins, and he's an emotional guy whose feelings are all too clear at all times, and I love that. He's the counterbalance to all of these psycho characters that I relate to. Wait, that came out wrong. He's the counterpart to all these psycho characters that we relate to much better. Now, don't get me wrong, he goes through plenty of hardships too, but the difference is, for him, it's not hidden. Meliodas does not cry until that druid training arc where he realizes it's okay to cry and you have to cry to embrace your emotions. Ban doesn't cry until he's already in his second relapse after re-becoming friends with Meliodas and genuinely giving to his friend, where he starts to pull himself out of his mental issues. Escanor doesn't cry because cry is not a word in his dictionary, okay? And Gowther doesn't cry. Well, he has no emotions. He would love to cry, but he can't. King's a pussy, and I love him. He cries whenever he wants to cry. He gets angry when a normal person should get angry. He thinks Ban caused his sister's death, so he wanted to kill Ban. He learned Meliodas was a demon, and he figured, hey, can we really trust Meliodas? He's in love with Diane, who didn't remember him and instead loved Meliodas, and he felt crushed by it. Now, I would argue that his mental state as a outward, not suppressed personality is in far better shape throughout the entirety of the series than any of the previous 4 characters I've mentioned. When he's sad, he's outwardly sad instead of trying to bottle it up and make believe he's happy, but when he's happy, he's actually happy, not internally sad with a facade of being happy. King is the perfect counterbalance, and I love him for it. As a character by his own right, I wouldn't say I sorrowfully relate to him to the extent that I do to the Holy Trinity of depressed weirdos, but again, that's for personal reasons. I could see why certain people, more outward, extroverted people, would relate to King far better than any of the other characters. I see it, and I respect it so much, because not only does that make King in himself an amazing character, but his contrast goes to show exactly what's wrong with everyone else. That's the 5 male characters of the 7 Deadly Sins. Each of them impacts the psychological tale of the 7 Deadly Sins narrative in a different way. A different type of mental burden, a different type of personality, and a different type of coping mechanism with the mental burdens. And Gowther, who also has mental burdens, but we can't relate, but that's because it's a fantasy and it goes to broaden our minds as far as the fantasy setting of a psychological story. I love all 5 of these characters from the 7 Deadly Sins, with all of them except for Gowther being in my top 5 characters in all of the story, with my 4th favorite character probably being Esterosa. Man, do I hope this video gets good views. I mean, ad revenue, I guess, is also a plus, but genuinely, I just want more people to see this show and to see it in this way. Please help. If I would have picked an anime to ask for shares, it would be like Black Clover or Naruto or something, where they're considered more family-friendly than the 7 Deadly Sins, and the ad revenue's way better. Did you see that? That was what I like to call psychological manipulation, trying to convince you that I'm not just a tool asking for shares for more views. Did you see that? Very cool, Nux Taku. Very cool. I'm too self-aware for this. I suck at self-promotion. Please share the video anyway. Next sin, Diane, the first of the women of the 7 Deadly Sins. So now, since for the most part, shonen anime are targeted at a male audience, I do believe they gave most of the male characters these psychological issues for the male viewers to relate to and understand better. That said, since the majority of the psychological tale of the 7 Deadly Sins is focused on a facade bottling down emotions, which is far more prevalent in males than in females, that's the majority of the male members of the Sins as well. So with Merlin and Diane, I believe it's focused far more impacting the story element on a superficial level than the psychological level we see in all these other characters that I love so much. So while I do like both Diane and Merlin more than Diane, they're not in my 5 favorite characters for this reason. So let's talk talk Diane, aside from being someone that King likes, which impacts King's role in the narrative, she herself is originally introduced as the first humanoid that does not look like a human. I understand Meliodas is a demon, but we don't know that when we come into the series right at the get-go. It kind of looks like, you know, you have holy knights that have magic powers, and you have Lord Twigo, who's clearly head and shoulders above everyone else, but everyone looks the same. And then Diane comes along saying, no, there are clearly different races and different boundaries between these races. This introduces you and opens your eyes to lore. There will be a lore to this world that will be explored. That's so good. And just by your introduction alone, I love that. Now, past her introduction, there's always this issue. How can King, a fairy, who's a smidgen shorter than Diane, who's a giant, fall in love? How can this be? Now, that's another little theme, how love crosses boundaries and can break walls between different peeps. And I do appreciate that, don't get me wrong. It's not, at least for me, as impactful as the psychological theme that we see in some of the other characters. But you have Meliodas and Elizabeth, a couple that's fated not to be together due to curses and whatever, but they will break that. You have Bon and Elaine, where Elaine is dead, but death will not stop Bon's love. You have Escanor and Merlin, and I don't know where that's going exactly. And you have King and Diane, how races cannot stop the power of love. Now, I don't want to go ahead and sound corny because that's not my type of thing, but let's not make believe this does not have any real meaning in our world either. There are always people judging you and saying that things are impossible, and honestly, I just genuinely believe that Diane's theme is to say that no, different races mean nothing. We're all the same, and if I love King, then I will be with King. I think it's simple. I think it's cute. Don't judge me. I'm not getting all mushy here, okay? Next, Sin, Merlin, far less romantic than Diane, and slightly smaller boobs as well. Now, Merlin comes into the series as the all-knowing one. And again, she has spoilers in the manga that I will not be discussing, but by the fact that she's introduced with this smug air of understanding that no other character really has, it makes you realize that there is what to be understood. Now, if you have the characters muddling forward, you don't know the breadth of the world that you will be eventually seeing. Meliodas isn't dumb by any means, but he's just too carefree to put all the pieces together for us. Merlin somehow understands everything there is to know about the narrative of the sins. She knew about Escanor. She developed the concept of putting together the 7 deadly sins. She knew about the commandments. She knew about Arthur, who we have yet to see exactly what he's gonna do because if that was it, that's pretty lame. But by the fact that you have a character that knows so much, everything that she knows exists in the world. You cannot know what doesn't exist. So by her being introduced as knowing a ton, that means there will be a ton that has yet to be revealed. The rest is manga spoilers. I don't want to really get into it. That was my analysis on the impact of all 7 deadly sins, on the narrative of the 7 deadly sins. I hope you enjoyed this video. It took forever to make because, well, it's a bit of a long one. And for that reason, I will not be doing a really long, cringy outro, purely for my sanity. Thank you all so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed. If you did, please leave a like, subscribe for future anime analyses, and let me know what future episodes in this series of impacts of groups of characters you would like to see. They're a fun time to make, even though they're a little bit time-consuming. Please share this video around. I really want the 7 deadly sins to get more recognition for what it actually is, and it's actually a really thought-out, great story. I have a fun time with it, and I also really relate to a lot of it. Link in the description to my Twitter. Feel free to follow me there. To my Patreon, please consider donating and joining the Discord server. To my merch, feel free to pick some up. It's not Maverick, but it's pretty lit. I love y'all. Thanks for sticking around this far. If you're wondering why I didn't cover Lord Twigo, it's because we don't know enough about him to discuss him yet, and anything I say about him is technically a spoiler because he's far past our wildest dreams and imagination as far as his impact on everything. Hope you enjoyed that little dose of cringe meme at the end there. Lord Twigo meme managed to somehow live through an entire year of 2018. Props to Lord Twigo. Have yourself a most wonderful evening, and don't bottle up all your emotions. It's okay to be weird. And with that said, remember to stay weird, fam.